Dr. Chava Green. She's from Philadelphia. Chava's an educator, a writer, and a public speaker. She has a PhD in religion from Emory University, where she wrote her dissertation on Hasidic feminism, exploring the role of gender in Chabad society and its mystical texts.
Wow.
She lives in Philadelphia with her husband and 3 children. Please welcome Dr. Chava Green.
Okay, hi everyone. Good evening. This is such a pleasure to be here. I just graduated my PhD last May, and I'll take me on the road. So this is really one of my first times, like going through and telling my whole story, and I'm so happy to be here at the lovely Jewish Villa in Chicago. Okay, you guys can hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, so about 1.5 years ago, at the bris of my second son, I had 3 little kids. We had a male come from Crown Heights, and he was the brother of my husband's rabbi. And after the bris, I was sitting in a side room, just, eating a little bit, and he came in to check on the baby. And my husband's rabbi wanted to. Should I get closer?
Yeah.
Should I just hold it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's better. Okay. So he wanted to make me feel comfortable. So he's saying, the Greens, they were in Atlanta, they moved here, and Chava just got her PhD. And so the male, he's like a serious old school Hasidic, like long gray beard, white beard, and he says, "Oh, what did you study?" So in these situations, I always have the opportunity. I can say like something part of like normal Jewish studies, religion, or I can go all in with the Hasidic feminism and see how people react. So I was not going to miss out on this opportunity. So I was like, I study Hasidic feminism. And he looks at me astounded, and he says something in Yiddish, which I didn't know, but I got the idea, which he was basically like, impossible, like that. And so then he said something really interesting to me. He said, you can't have Hasidic feminism. I'll say it and then I'll translate. He said, Hasidus is bittul, and feminism is yeshus. So Hasidus is self-nullification, transcendence to God, and feminism is like all about selfishness and ego. And so, yes, on some level he's true, but I told him, look, you know about Hasidus, but I know about feminism. So I was like, feminism has many, many branches, many, many facets, and I'm going to make a Hasidic feminism. And he looked at me and was like, okay. And I just went the mile. So I'm really at the beginning of this kind of process. I just graduated with my PhD, and I wrote about Hasidic feminism, but really where this idea comes from is from the story of my life. Being very, very enmeshed in the world of feminism as an undergraduate, and then becoming religious, and now finally trying to bring together the different worlds of my life. So that's the story I'm going to tell you all tonight. Okay, so just to start with a little background about my upbringing. How did I end up here? Where did I start from? So in my family, we had very little connection to religion. You can even say my parents are a little bit anti-religious. They're very liberal, secular, from New York. Well, my parents are originally from Boston, but I was born in Manhattan. And my mom's side of the family is Jewish. And my Jewish grandparents were like a decade almost older than my dad's parents, who are not Jewish. And my dad's side of the family is actually Quaker Protestant. And my Nana, my dad's mother, was a Unitarian minister. And so she was an educator at this very liberal church, and she would just pull stories from everywhere. So I grew up hearing like the stories of what she called the Hebrew Bible, like Joseph and the Code, and she talked to me about, we used to go to her house to celebrate Easter, and then she would bring in like Passover things. And so I grew up with like a very interesting relationship to religion. Sadly, my Jewish grandmother passed away from Alzheimer's when I was like young, so I didn't have much relationship with her. But at some point, my Nana, who imbued a lot of spirituality in me, she left formal religion. She became very disillusioned. And growing up, she always told me, religion is made up by dead white men, and we don't want anything to do with that. And so I grew up thinking, like, okay, organized religion is like, a farce, even like with like negativity towards it, but an interest in like spirituality. And my family, our religion was really the arts and culture. So my parents, I was born in Manhattan. Every weekend we'd go to galleries, and when we moved to Philly, I remember my dad taking me to like experimental dance troupes, like on the weekends. And even in our home, we had these interesting, interior designers with like notable furniture from them. And my parents were really into like ethnic food and culture. And so I grew up kind of thinking like, what is of meaning is to really know about the world. And so I was an avid reader, and I read, I went through all the classics. In our house, we had the Great Books, which is a series of all important books in Western civilization. So that was my background. And by the time I got to college, I had felt that in high school, kind of typical teenage angst. I went to a public high school, and I think a little bit because of my personality, and also maybe because when I was about 12, my parents got divorced. And so I didn't really get into the social scene, having a boyfriend in high school. I kind of felt like I want a really meaningful relationship. And I understood I was not going to have that with a high school boyfriend. And so part of me kind of was a little bit outside of my social groups. I have good friends, but I also kind of was an observer of people, which makes sense that now I'm an anthropologist, because that's what I do. But I also felt in high school kind of not fitting in completely. And I was like, when I get to college, I'm going to find my people. And so I applied to a few small liberal arts schools, and I was just dreaming of what my life's going to be like when I go to college. It's going to be a new world for me. And I came back from spring break, my senior year. I show up at my dad's house, my childhood home, and I go up the stairs. And I don't know if any of you know anything about college admissions, but when you get accepted, you get a big packet in the mail. Welcome, these are all the information you need to know. So I walked up the stairs and I took a bunch of letters out of the mailbox, and there was a little stack of thin envelopes. And I was like, oh no. I went inside and I ripped open one rejection letter after another. I was the top of my class, I had a 4.1 GPA, I was the varsity tennis captain, I was on World Affairs Councils, and I didn't get into college. It was crazy. A year before me, 9 people had gone to Ivy League schools in my grade. And so my guidance counselor was like, don't worry about a safety school, you don't need any of that. And at that moment, my life really changed, because my identity was set in a certain narrative. And when something happened that really shook who I thought I was, I went through a period of grief for a few weeks. And then I was thinking, what if my life doesn't have to follow the typical narrative that I see around me, that everyone else is doing? What if I chose what I want to do? And so I played with some ideas of studying abroad, or being an au pair somewhere, or working for a year. And then I saw that I could actually still apply to my local state school, Rutgers. So I applied, and I did get in. I was like, okay, I'll go to college. but even the inkling of my life could be different. So I went into college already with that thought of, I want to choose my own life. I don't want to follow just what I'm supposed to do. Okay, so my freshman year, my dad drops me off on campus, and his parting words of advice for me were, say yes to everything except drugs. So he was like, have fun, enjoy life. Even when he dropped me off at the airport now, I was like, Dad, do you realize how crazy college was? He's like, that's a very important part of growing up. You have to be off on your own. I'm like, I'm not sending my kids to college like that. But anyway, so but I was excited to go to college and dive into everything. So my freshman year, I didn't know what I wanted to study necessarily. I loved Spanish, so I took some Spanish courses. And then I was just looking through all the lists of classes, and it's interesting what I chose. I chose an Intro to Religion course and an Intro to Women's Studies. So the religion course was a dud. It was 8 a.m. in the morning. The professor was just a monotonous tone. I didn't really pay attention. But the Women's Studies course was amazing, and it really changed my life. So the professor was an indigenous woman, a graduate student from Columbia, the country, not the university. And she spoke a lot about indigenous women's spirituality. And she was teaching us about kind of this upswelling in the women's movement in the 70s, of an interest in divine feminine and goddess religions. And I was like, this is so cool and interesting, and a lot of things I'd never heard about before. And, okay, I need 2 hands to do this, but bear with me. So she drew something on the board. Okay, so first she drew a triangle pointing down, like this. She said, this is the divine masculine, the giver. And then on top of it, she put another triangle. She's like, that's the divine feminine, the receiver. Whoa. So I remember thinking, I did not actually really identify as being Jewish. I was like, my mom's Jewish. I'm nothing. But I remember seeing that, thinking whoa, there's meaning behind symbols and ideas in the world that I don't know anything about. Okay, so that first class, I really fell in love with feminism, because I know it sounds obvious, but sometimes when you're a young person, you think the world started when you were born. So I grew up in like the millennial generation where I'm just like, you know, I just took for granted anything I wanted to do as a woman, I could do. Like, you know, nothing's gonna stand in my way. And as I was learning about feminism, I realized like this is a gift of generations of women before me who, you know, fought for women's representation in the government and women's just ability to vote and like so many things I took for granted. Started learning about the history, women's history, the history of feminism, and I was really enamored. And I also learned about like the different waves. So like I said, the first wave of feminism having the vote, the second wave of feminism, which is about more political representation, and then also that kind of spiritual feminism. And then later I started learning about third wave feminism, which I'm going to get to, and it became like a totally different topic. But that first semester I was like super into feminism. And the other thing that we did that semester was we read this book called Guyland, which was about masculinity on college campus. And the argument of the author was that in Greek life, women are like pawns between guys who are trying to bolster their reputation or their status. And this like really disturbed me because I was seeing this happen on my college campus. Like I would, you know, I was out, we'd go to parties, I would see things in my dorm, and I felt like the real breakdown in kind of boundaries around sexuality was like a net loss for women. Like I felt like individual women would say, I feel so empowered, I want to wear whatever I want, and I was like, okay, I can get behind that. But then, remember I said I was kind of like stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, and I was like, I feel like it's not really supporting like the development of stable, like loving, committed relationships because everyone's having all these experiences and they're really not prioritizing like family, marriage. And I think Hashem kind of gave me this like inner clarity that that's really what I wanted. I actually went to a feminist march in New York one semester. And the idea of the march was to protest against sexual violence against women, which I felt really strongly about, and I still do. And at that march, one of the arguments that the people were making is that if a woman is, like, if a man commits sexual violence to a woman, you should never ask, like, what she was wearing. Like, what she was wearing has no implications on that. And I'm like, sure. But at this march, there were some women walking through the streets of New York City naked to, like, make this point. And I was like, what? I felt like the emperor's new clothes. You guys know that story?
Yeah.
Like, the emperor's naked, and everyone has to pretend he's wearing clothes. This was like the reverse of that. Like, they're naked, and we all have to pretend that's a really great idea. Like, I was like, this is not going to increase the status and dignity of women in society. There was like this disconnect for me of like honoring and thinking what's unique and important about a woman, being a woman, and then like certain aspects of the kind of social justice world I was in that was taking it to like an extreme. I was very conflicted because also being in that environment, it's like heretical to like question certain beliefs, you know? Okay, so the next thing that I learned about feminism, which ironically, this kind of led to a little bit of my interest in Judaism. Okay, this is gonna sound really funny, but this was my aha moment. So I went to the Women's Center, I started getting involved, and in the first meeting, I saw sitting around, like at the Women's Center, the students who were like a few years older than me. Some of them didn't have their legs shaved, which is like a classic feminist stereotype, you know? And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then at some point I asked them, like, what's this about? And they're like, well, it's a made-up beauty standard by, you know, the capitalist machine to get us to buy all of these beauty products that we don't need. Like, we have just natural hair in our body just like men. Why do we have to remove all of it? And I was like, interesting. And I was like, you know what's crazy though? I never in my life thought about that. Like, when I was just growing up, I just took it for granted that when you reach a certain age, like, there are things you do as a woman. And they were saying, it doesn't have to be that way. We can think about the things we're doing and why we're doing them. And then, what are, like, the implications behind it, okay? And so what, you know, the shaving legs aside, that idea was really changed how I looked at things. Because I started, like, seeing commercials on TV and thinking, this is like the objectification of women, is like hidden in this, and it was like, it's kind of like feminism, like you feel like you're in a cult now, and then all of a sudden everything's like through the lens of that. So sometimes people ask me, how do my parents and my family feel about me being being Orthodox Jew? And I'm like, well, they survived me being a radical feminist, so that by the time I was an Orthodox Jew, they were like, okay, we actually think this is a little bit better. Like, this is like a little bit more understandable. Okay, so I was learning a lot of things in women's studies that I was really excited about, and then some things that were, like, didn't sit right with me just kind of my personality and some of my other thoughts about relationships and sexuality. So after my freshman year, I went to England to study abroad for a few weeks. And I went to the library. My mom has always worked in the library since I was little. It's like a homey place to me. So I was like, I'm gonna go to the library. And I walked up to the computer and it's like a little sign blinking, what are you interested in? So of course I wrote feminism. And this book popped up called The Fate of the Feminine Soul. And so I checked it out and I just carried it around with me for 2 weeks. And the author made such an interesting point. She said that without a feminine soul in social movements, there is no moral compass. And I was like, this is exactly what I'm feeling. Like, because the place that feminism is at now in the third wave of feminism is that gender is socially constructed. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this idea. That gender is made up of a lot of kind of social norms that women feel like they have to fit into, but there's nothing like behind gender that's like innate. So that's like kind of the contemporary view of gender. And I felt like what that did was erase like a deep femininity and like a more essential trait of like what it means to be a woman. I had a feeling it was something. And I felt like, well, when you take that out of the social movements, then you start having these, more extreme things going on. So I came back to my sophomore year in a bit of a different social situation. I was playing rugby, actually, and I had a knee injury. And so all of a sudden I'm on crutches, and it turns out my rugby friends weren't such friends when I, couldn't go out anymore and hang out with them. And so I was just kind of stuck in my dorm. And because I had joined the honors program, it happens to be our particular dorm was right next to the Hillel. And so a lot of Jewish students would go into this honors program to be in this dorm. So while I was recovering from knee surgery, I was hanging out in my dorm, and some of the Jewish students asked me if I wanted to go to the Hillel for a barbecue. So I was like a little bit interested in, finding some new social friends, and so I was like, sure. So I remember walking up the steps of the Hillel and getting nervous they were gonna ask me about something about Judaism. And I was like, I don't know anything about Judaism, but I know the blessing for Hanukkah candles. So I was like saying it in my head, like in case they asked me. And like it was ridiculous, because like even like non-Jewish people go to the Hillel, like they did not care. They just handed me a hot dog. And then I just signed in, like I signed up at the entrance paper. And a few weeks later, they sent me an email, do you want to go to Israel for free? And I was like a little nervous. In my mind, Israel is like always in a war. Back then, it actually wasn't at the time, but and I wanted to study abroad the next year, and I was like, my parents aren't going to pay for me to study abroad again. I'm like, a free trip? This is amazing. So I was like, sure, I signed up, and I kind of like forgot about it a little bit. 2 weeks later, a regular day, I went to sleep, and at night I had a dream that someone in my family passed away. And it was really scary, and I was like running between my family members, like, who is it? And then I had this really weird, like, 2 hours of like black sleep. And I'm like, my whole life I've been a morning person. Like, I'll wake up and make muffins for breakfast, like in the morning. So it was really weird. I woke up really late. I had unconsciously turned my alarm off. I was like frantically packing my bags to get to my class. And I'm in my class and I see a missed call from my father. So I go out of class and I go sit by this little man-made lake on campus. It's like weeping willow trees, and I call him and he's like, your grandfather passed away last night. I never had like a mystical thing happen to me before, and I felt like kind of like the veil of reality was like pulled away for a second. I saw behind it, like there's like a soul level reality. And I also, at the age of 20, had like an existential crisis. Like my grandfather was the first person really close to me who passed away. I was like, one day I'm also gonna die. Like, why am I living my life? What is the purpose of life? Like, I like couldn't move forward. I was really stuck, and I was just thinking about it all the time. And the next week, I was on a flight to Israel. And in my mind, it's totally unrelated. I'm not going to get answers to my questions. Little did I know, I was going to get answers to my questions. So that birthright trip left me with a lot to think about. The first thing I realized is I'm Jewish. Okay, so not just my mom is Jewish, but that means it's my own identity that I can own. And now it opens up this like whole treasure box of like a religion, a culture, a tradition, an ethnicity, like everything that I never really knew existed fully. The next thing is that we went to Sfat in the north, and I had had a meditative practice. I was involved with like a campus group that did meditation, and also this like Hindu chanting group which after I became religious, I went back there once and we were chanting the names of the gods, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is a Vodazara, I have to get out of here. And I like ran out of the room. But at the time, I was like really into this like meditative practice, and so we were in Sva, and we went to this, to an artist there. I don't know if any of you have been to Sva and been to his gallery, but he has a whole shtick for birthright groups. They walk in and he pretends to be like totally on drugs. He's like, dude, Judaism is so cool. It's so deep. Like, and so I was in that group and I was just thinking, this sounds really cool. And they had said that I could have a bas mitzvah at the kotel, because I never went to a synagogue growing up. I never had a bas mitzvah. And I was like, what does that involve? And they said, you have to pick a Jewish name. So they were like suggesting some names to me, like Zipporah, or like different names, and I'm like, how do I pick? So we're in this gallery in Svat, and the artist is talking about Adam and Chava, and I heard this name, and I'm like, that's my name. And I went up to him afterwards, and I was like, what is the name Chava? And he says, it's like Eve, and means the mother of all life. I was like, oh my gosh, do you know I'm the biggest feminist? Like, this is perfect for me. So I picked my name Chava. It took me a few years before I started going by it, but I picked my name. And he also recommended this fascinating book called The Jew and the Lotus, which was about a group of Jews that were invited by the Dalai Lama to go to, where was he in exile? Nepal? I don't know. So the Dalai Lama, his people were exiled from Tibet, right? So he asked all these Jews to come, and he said, teach me your secrets of how you kept your religion alive in exile. And so this group of Jews from all different backgrounds taught him about basically the fundamental principles of Judaism. And ironically, through that book, I was like, oh, now I'm learning about the fundamentals of Judaism. Okay, and then the last thing, there's two more things. So one was I was an ardent atheist in high school, and the idea of the universe made sense. The universe means things to happen, but God, that was a big jump for me. But I had this moment on Birthright. We went to the kotel, and it was not when they brought huge groups during the day. We went at night one time. It was quiet and cool, and I walked up to the kotel, and I put my head against the stones, and all of a sudden I felt this peaceful emptiness. Just all the worries and anxieties and life just kind of melted away for a moment. It's you know what, maybe that is enough for me right now. Maybe I don't need to jump into a whole big belief system, but just to look for some more peace in my life and some quiet within me. And then the last thing that happened is that on the trip there was a Dati Leumi woman, a national religious woman, who was running 40 birthright groups, and her kids were home with her husband. And I walked with her on Shabbos, and she just kind of broke all my misconceptions about religious women, just by her force of character. And she also talked to me a little bit about Taras Mishpacha, family purity, and modesty, and just ideas that I had really never heard about. And like I said, I kind of had this innate feeling that that modesty was a good idea, but I never had words for it. And when she was explaining to me as a form of communication, what you wear kind of communicates to the world, your values and what you believe, and especially in the Jewish community, kind of your affiliations. And I was like, yeah, clothing as a form of communication made a lot of sense to me. So I came back to campus, and I was basically what is Judaism? This was my thing that I'm going to figure out. Also, I bought a English Tanakh, and I just sat on the bus, and I would see all the kids around me studying for their tests and doing their homework, and I was just reading the Bible. And I would hide it from people because it's kind of embarrassing, on a secular college. But I was reading the stories, and I'm this is so juicy. This is so cool. Just is so interesting. Just the plain words of the Torah were so interesting. So that semester, I made meetings with all of the rabbis on campus: Reconstructionist, Reform, Conservative, and then the Orthodox rabbis. And I just went to them and I said, what is Judaism? And I felt with a lot of the denominations, they were telling me about their denomination of Judaism, and I felt there was a little disconnect. And then I went to the Orthodox Rebbetzin, and she said, can you read Hebrew? I'm no. She's why don't we start there? I'm that sounds like a great place to start. And we also started learning Pirkei Avos, the ethics of our fathers. And so as a more academic person, I love that she gave me a text, and also language is access into study. And so I really resonated with that. So that semester, I got really close to this Rebbitzin, and I joined. There was like a non-Hasidic outreach group on the campus, and I joined, and I just fell in love with Shabbos. And going to people's homes and seeing like big families. So I grew up with one sibling, and like I said, my Jewish grandparents wasn't very close to them, and my grandma passed away, and then I just had my other grandparents, and that's my whole family. I have one cousin who I wasn't very close to, and I always felt bereft of like, you know, a family structure that was like bigger than just me and my intimate family. And so going away for Shabbos and like kind of like being within not just one family where I was staying, but a whole community of people sharing their values, I felt like it was literally coming home. And so I had one experience that was really cemented some things for me. So we went to Lakewood, my friend and I, for Shabbos. And when we got to the rabbi's house, my friend and I, we had been going to Friday night services on campus. And so when we got to Lakewood, the guys are all getting ready to go to shul, to synagogue. My friend and I are like, we're coming too. And the rabbi was like, I don't know about that. We're like, what do you mean? I was like, I'm going. He's like, okay. So he takes us. We get to the shul. He like, can't find the women's at the door. He's like, I don't know if anyone's going to be there. Like, he's like, okay, go up this little like, little steps. So we go up these steps, and basically the shul was like one long rectangular room, and the women's section was a little balcony on top, and in front of us was like this big glass wall, and we could see like all the men below us. It was so cool. And I was sitting there like with the sitter. I didn't really know Hebrew, but I was reading some English words, and I was looking down, the men start dominating, and I just felt like transported back to like the shtetl of old. Like they're all in their black hats, and it's so peaceful, and like I was like, oh, this is so nice. Like something like deep within me like really felt like at home. And then they're singing Lecha Dodi, the song of welcoming in the bride of Shabbos. And I always loved poetry. Part of the reason I wanted to become a Spanish major was because of the poetry of Pablo Neruda. And so I was really into poetry. And so I was reading Lecha Dodi like a poem. And I was like thinking about the imagery and like the feminine imagery and the bride of Shabbos. And all of a sudden, there's a part in Lecha Dodi where everyone stands up and they turn around. And so my friend and I are the only ones in the women's section. There's this big glass wall in front of us. And all of a sudden, like 100 men stand up and turn around, and they're just looking right at us. And I'm just like, ah. And, but then all of a sudden I realized like they're not looking at us. I'm like, oh, it's a one-way mirror. So we can see them, but they can't see us. And I was just like, in that moment, it was like uncomfortable, but I was also like, what are they doing? They're welcoming the Shabbos queen. Like my friend and I, we're the Shabbos queen. And I was like, even if it's like subconscious for them, they say it every week, I was like, wow, we are in a community that has like, you know, a deep, like mystical idea of like honoring the feminine, honoring the women. And at that time, it bothered me a little bit that the women weren't in shul, and like I certainly carried some of my feminist sensibilities like throughout my journey. For a long time, I thought certain aspects of the ultra-Orthodox world were like extreme, you know, but looking back, I was like, really, what were the women doing in Lakewood? They were making Shabbos in their home. So when everyone would go home, there would be delicious soup, there would be the Shabbos environment. And we know that Shabbos creates the energy for the whole week to come. And so really that feminine energy is like sustaining the whole world, sustaining their families. And so I was like really, really deep in this mindset. So that summer I went back to Israel for 3 weeks. I spent some time in seminary. And even though, like I said, I had my reservations, I was like, you know what, I'm going to try out being Orthodox, like an experiment. Okay? So remember, I was very academic, and I was like, I don't know 100% if this is true or not, but I'm going to do an experiment, and then I'll test, like, if it feels right, if I'm enjoying it, if I'm like learning more, that's pushing me forward. So I was like, I'm gonna keep Shabbos kosher, dress more modestly, and then do shomer negiah, just like guarding the touch between genders. And I felt like on a college campus that would be like a radical thing to do. You know? So what happens? I came back to America, and 2 weeks later I was on a plane to Spain. Oh boy, because I was a Spanish major, and before this whole Jewish thing, I had signed up to study abroad. So what did Spain do to all the Jews? Kick them out. So unfortunately, it was a very difficult time for me to grow in my Judaism. But looking back, it was such a blessing because I needed to slow down. Like I think I was going way too fast in my journey, and I probably would have gotten burnout. And I even did get burnout certain times, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, what is my life? I'm changing too quickly. So that time in Spain was a really important time for me to kind of step back and think about, remember, like, what are the things I learned, and then also build my relationship with Hashem. So there's one moment that sticks out to me where I was just, the more I was looking for God, the more I was seeing him. So we went on a weekend trip to Porto in Portugal, and I had become a vegetarian. So I was like, I can't be kosher in Spain. Everything is made with something called manteca de cerda, which is pork lard. They cook everything with that. So at least I can explain kosher to people in Spain, but I can say I'm a vegetarian. Is there any meat products in this? They got that. So we went to Portugal, and one of my friends in our group was like talking up this like Portuguese chicken, like it's the most delicious thing. And we're like traveling around. I'm like, I'm not going to eat that. But one day we had like done a tour the entire day. We're starving. We're walking down these big steps, and it's like so beautiful, and we smell the most delicious smell. I'm so hungry, and I'm just like, no, Hashem, like I don't need this challenge right now. And I'm like, please, like give me the strength not to eat any non-kosher meat. And we walk into the restaurant, and there's a big sign in English, vegan restaurant. And I was like, I literally was like, this is a miracle. Like, thank you. I was like, I know they have vegan restaurants in Portugal. Like, and so there was moments like that sprinkled throughout my, that time where I just saw Hashem as like helping me and guiding me through this process. I did this social experiment. I came back to campus, and I did this social experiment being Shomer Negia. And it was so fascinating, people's reactions. And I also found that, unfortunately, there were actually a lot of people that when I started talking about Judaism, they had grown up either religious or more Jewish and then had left it. And something about me, like jumping into like something Jewish really triggered in their minds, like, oh, why would you choose that? Like, I'm like trying to not do that thing. Like, college is way more fun. And I was like, sure, but like this is a crucial part of your identity. Like, you shouldn't leave this so quickly. And I actually had like a really nice group of Jewish friends that year. And I felt like I would even make Shabbos meals for them. Like I was like starting my shluchas, in college before I was even really religious. So Shomer Negia was interesting for me. Like I would show up at a party with a friend, and he would go to hug my friend, and then he would turn to me, and I called it the Shomer beat. He would be like, and then he would just stop. And I was thinking, like, we live in a culture where a lot of the borders around men and women have been broken down. And I was like, I felt like it was such a powerful, radical statement to be like, you can't assume that you can touch me. Like, I felt that, especially for the development of healthy relationships, there should be a period where people don't touch and they get to know each other, which is why I love the idea of matchmaking and shidduch dating. So my senior year, I wrote an honors thesis called The Possibility of an Orthodox Jewish Feminism. I interviewed a number of women who grew up secular like me and became religious about their thoughts on women's role in Judaism. I wrote about modesty, balancing motherhood with a career, and the dating system, Shomer Negia. And I had an advisor who was a very well-known like black feminist activist, and she read my dissertation, and she called me into her office the next day. And she said, I stayed up all night reading this, doubting all of my past relationships. I was like, oh no, I didn't mean to send you into like, the drama. But I realized like this Jewish wisdom is not just for Jews. This is for everybody to develop healthy relationships. And she was saying like, a lot of the people I interviewed, they were like, if you're in this like infatuation stage and having intimacy before you get married, and you get married and that's gone, you might think, what is our relationship based upon? And so that was a really important period for me of like kind of integrating and trying to really think about a lot of the Jewish ideas I had been learning through the lens of some feminist concepts. Then I graduated and I went to Israel for 2 years to get the Jewish education that I never had. It was an amazing time. It would take another like 2 hours to talk about everything that happened during that period. But something I did is I like had this love for like the Hasidic world, and I would see Hasidic people walking through the streets of Jerusalem, and I would just feel so drawn to them. And my second year in seminary, my mom mentioned to me that my grandmother had a niece, and I could never figure out how to make the relationship to me. But like my grandmother's niece was alive, and my great grandmother's niece So like she was the age of my grandmother. She was living in Florida, and she had heard that I was in Israel, and she wanted to speak to me. So I was like, oh, interesting. So she calls me up, we had a long conversation, and she wanted to tell me about where our family came from. So she said that our family was from a town called Slobodka in Ukraine, and we were descendants of the famous rabbi of the town, Moshe Shapiro. My great-grandmother's last name was Shapiro. So I was learning in Chabad seminary, and so I told one of the rabbis there, like, do you know anything about this? And he said, that's the town that the Tanya was printed in. And the Shapiro brothers, they own the printing press. I was like, that's crazy. My family has gone so far away from that, and something within me just kept pulling me back and back and back. And so there was a period where I was in a non-Chabad seminary, in like the Haredi world in Israel. And I loved so much about that community, the real passion for Hashem and for learning and for chesed. But as a woman, especially coming from my background, I felt that there was sometimes like a disconnect in that there's areas of Torah that women are not really allowed to learn, or it's like super discouraged. And even in seminary, I asked one of the rabbis, I was like, I'm an academic person and I want to learn the Gemara, I want to learn the Talmud. And so he was like, well, Pirkei Avos is from the Mishnah, which is part of the Talmud. And he kind of like asked, like, and I was like, you're brushing me off right now. And so I kind of was like, I'm not exactly like completely myself in this world. And then unfortunately there was a terrorist attack in Harnof across the street from the seminary I was in.
I remember that.
Yeah, and it was so unsettling and I couldn't sleep. I was like, I really need to leave Jerusalem. So remember I had this like love of Sfat, this connection to Sfat. I'm like, I'm going to go back to Sfat. So I moved back to Sfat without any plan, which was a terrible idea, because in Sfat you could just float away. So I like lived in this cave, like painting, and like I was like, what am I doing with my life? And so I would like walk through the streets, and one day I saw a sign for a Beis Chabad with English classes. And I was like, okay, you know what, I'm going to go back to learning and like be in more formal settings. So I went into this room, and it was so interesting. There was a group of women who were like in their 60s, had gotten divorced, and they decided to restart their life in Israel. And so there was like a little group of them, and they had this class at the Beis Chabad. And the Chabad rabbi, so I knew about Chabad on campus, but I didn't know that it was a very sophisticated, philosophical system of written text. And so the Chabad rabbi it was right before Passover, and he was explaining how each of the 10 plagues correspond to 10 sphirot, divine emanations. And they also correspond to 10 parts of our psyche that we can like overcome to be free from Egypt. And I was like, this is fascinating. Like, this is so complex and deep. How did you figure this out? He's like, I did not figure this out. He's like, this is from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So I was like, I need to learn more of this. He's like, you're in luck. There's a Chabad seminary for Bali Tshuva across the street called Machon Alta. So I was like, okay, sign me up. So that was my kind of introduction to Chabad. And that's when I also started learning about the Rebbe's vision for women. And I was like, I didn't have the words for it then, but I really felt like this is the Hasidic feminism I was looking for. Because the Rebbe has a talk where he specifically says that as women become more educated in the secular world, their Jewish education has to keep the pace. And so not only are women allowed to learn the oral Torah, they should learn it. And they should learn the back and forth and the complex reasoning, because that will cement their trust in Hashem and their desire to keep the mitzvahs. And so a lot of the issues that I had been like bumping up against, I felt like, I was like, if I become Chabad, like this is, I'm going to be able to express myself fully. And also women's leadership in the Chabad community, like the Chabad Rebbetzins, being communal leaders, it felt like these are my people. Okay, so that's not to say that my journey was linear, like, going from one place to another. There was a lot of bumps along the way. And there were times, especially in Israel, where I was not with my family and, trying to find myself, and I would fall into periods of like a lot of doubts and confusion and like, where am I headed? And one of the things that I learned from that time period that I still rely on today is to just go back to my basic beliefs. So I would say to myself, like, can I live without Shabbos? Definitely not. Shabbos creates a whole structure and rhythm to my life. Could I believe that this world is an accident? No, this world is purposeful. It has meaning. It has depth And my life is not by accident. Everything is perfectly meant to be. And also, like, a lot of this whole journey was like returning to the tradition of my ancestors. And I was like, could I let this be lost again in my family now that I found it? I can't. And then the last one was like, could I return to the secular dating world? Definitely not. And so what I would do like through those periods was try to like go back to like my fundamentals. Okay, so I want to fast forward so I can speak a little bit more about my current work. I came back to the United States. I worked for 2 years for Chava on campus. I met my husband, which is a whole other story. By accident, I proposed to him. He's like, okay, that makes sense based on your personality. But he graciously said yes. And then that year, I had spoke to my rabbi how I really want to get my PhD. And he's like, you are not going by yourself, single, to some random place in America without any like foundation. And so I didn't listen. I applied to my PhD programs anyway. And in between applying to my PhD programs and moving to Atlanta, I met my husband and got married. And so my rabbi was prophetic in that sense. And so we moved to Atlanta. I started my PhD program. I had my first child, and I was in my program for 6 years. And I had 2 more kids. Having kids during graduate school was intense. I know Megara knows about that. My new Chicago friend. I graduated last May. And so my dissertation is called The Hasidic Face of Feminism, Gender Between Modernity and Mysticism in Chabad Lubavitch. So what I did is I have 2 pieces of my work. I did an ethnography of 50 women and 1 or 2 men in the Chabad community about their lives and about their relationship to certain crucial elements of Jewish womanhood. And then for each chapter, I also studied the texts from Hasidus and from the Rebbe's public talks, his sichas, about these topics. And one thing I wanted to uncover was the relationship between people's lived experience and the talks themselves. Sort of like the difference between how you live your Judaism and then the ideal. Like, what's the abstract concepts? And in the end, I found that there's a lot of striving. So people feel like they can't always live up to the ideal, but they know it. And they believe in it, and they believe in the Rebbe's vision. And in each chapter, there's different concepts. But really, the ultimate argument that I make is that what the Rebbe gives us is a vision of womanhood that holds on to tradition, brings tradition, but is not a return to the past, but bringing those values into the future. And in a lot of the Rebbe's talks, he'll say how the world is evolving and changing, and that when there's changes happening in the Jewish community, it's not a negative, it's not a loss. It's not because we're coming closer to Mashiach. Okay, and so I want to explain for a moment about the paradigms of masculinity and femininity. So the period of exile that we've been in for a long time is characterized by what you do. And the time of Geula, redemption, is characterized by who you are. Okay, and exile is a masculine mentality. Okay, so the male is all about revelation, action, content. And also in a sikha from Parshas Noach in Tafshin Nun, 1990, the Rebbe talks about 2 ways of transforming the world, a masculine way and a feminine way. And the masculine way is to have power over others, whether or not they are amenable to it, but to enforce your will, which is basically a war, right? And then in interpersonal relationships, like a mini war. Like, this is what I want, whether or not you want it, this is going to happen. And we know in parenting, once in a while, that's necessary. Like, this is what has to get done. But on a global scale, that's the way of exile, of kind of forcing the world to be the way you want. What's interesting to me is that feminism doesn't have a really, at least in my opinion, a really great reason for the oppression of women. There's this idea, there's this like kind of mystical thing of like the patriarchy, but how did that develop? Where does that come from? But this is the answer of Hasidus, is that when you have in Gullus a suppression of the feminine, so then there's also a suppression of women's voices. But it says explicitly in Judaism that when redemption comes, the voice of the Kala will be heard in the streets of Jerusalem. The voice of women will again rise up. And so what is redemption about? It's about who you are. It's about your essence, not about what you do. Think about Shabbos. Shabbos is not about doing anything, actually. It's about being. The feminine is about receiving Hashem's goodness and awakening the desire within others to follow the right path. And I see a shift in the world, right? And for me, parenting, Simon, this stage of life is like an obvious example of this. So you see like the positive parenting, gentle parenting that's now is all about like, kind of like getting into your child, having your child want that, okay? But what goal is going to be, it's not going to be that the masculine goes away. There's still a time for the masculine. The mashpia, the giver, is a crucial piece. But now there's going to be a balance. And the greatness of the feminine is going to be revealed. And so I want to just end by saying I think that really my work is that Jewish mysticism is the key to bring clarity to all of these confusions about gender. And what I'm doing now is figuring out how to make these teachings more accessible and more relevant. So thank you.